The last Veth ship left on a Tuesday. Nobody was certain it was a Tuesday. The calendar had been a casualty of the occupation, along with most of the satellite network and all 6 desalination plants on the northern coast. But Marisol Redcloud said it felt like a Tuesday, and the other two had learned not to argue with Marisol about feelings. They watched from the ridge above what used to be Haida Gwaii. The ship was a wedge of hammered bronze 3 kilometers wide, and it rose without sound, without drama, trailing nothing but a faint shimmer of displaced air, the way a fever breaks. One moment the sky held it. The next moment it didn't. "That's it then," said Devlin. He had a hand pressed flat against a dead spruce tree like he was checking its pulse. "That's it," Marisol confirmed. She had her arms crossed, not against the cold, but against the satisfaction she didn't quite know what to do with. It felt indecent somehow, being glad. There were 4 billion people who hadn't made it to feel glad about anything. The third member of their little remnant, a heavy-set woman named Yuki, who had been a freshwater hydrologist before the word freshwater became largely theoretical, pulled a dented flask from her jacket and held it out between them, without looking at either of them. Marisol took it, drank, passed it to Devlin. They stood on the ridge while the sky turned back into ordinary sky, and nobody said anything else for a long time. The Veth had not been conquerors in the way human history would have recognized. There were no thrones, no tribute, no slavery. What they had done was more like what a developer does to a field. They had simply proceeded. They had needed mineral compounds that existed in certain geological strata. They had needed atmospheric processors to prepare their secondary colony on the 4th planet out from the star they called the Lesser Sun, which humans had previously named something else. They had needed those things, and Earth had provided them. And the Veth had not been cruel, precisely, but they had been thorough, and thorough in the wrong places had meant the boreal forests of half a continent and the aquifer system underlying most of the interior plains and the krill populations in 3 separate ocean bodies, all of which had supported other things, which had supported other things, and so on, the way that kind of thoroughness always travels. 41 years. That was the duration of the occupation in the terms the survivors used among themselves, though occupation implied a presence that the Veth had, in fact, sustained for barely 11 of those years before most of them had departed for the Lesser Sun and left behind automated extraction infrastructure and a skeleton crew of compliance monitors. The compliance monitors had left 18 months ago. The extraction equipment had kept running on its own until a relay station, somewhere in the outer system, had stopped sending the maintenance signal, and the machines had powered down, one by one, over the course of a rainy October, with a series of subsonic thumps that Devlin had felt in his sternum from 40 kilometers away, and now they were alone. They and whoever else had survived, scattered across a landscape that looked like a fever dream of the planet it had been. They were not, it turned out, as few as they had feared. The first thing Marisol did, in the days after the ship disappeared, was walk. She had a habit of processing things on her feet. She'd been a land-use planner before, a good one. Someone who had known how to read a watershed the way other people read a room. And she needed to read this one before she could begin to think about what to do with it. She went south along the coast, then east, then inland, and she counted what she found. Spruce still holding in sheltered valleys where the extraction equipment hadn't reached. A creek running clear about 8 kilometers from an old processing site. She tasted it, spat, tasted again. Not clean, but cleaner than it had been. Salmonberry coming back along a south-facing slope, and people, more than she'd expected. Small groups mostly, some of them clustered around things that had kept working. A hand dug well, a seed cache someone had sealed in a steel drum before the first extraction towers went up. A fishing weir made entirely of materials that predated contact with the Veth by several centuries, which was possibly why the fish were still running there. The people she found were not, by and large, doing what she had expected survivors to be doing. They were working. They had a specific, focused quality to their attention, like craftspeople in the middle of something complicated. A woman named Hazel was managing a herd of cattle that had been left behind by a farming operation the Veth had displaced. She was moving them through a rotation. She said that she'd worked out from a memory of a memory, something her grandmother had described once about how the land used to be managed. She wasn't sure she was doing it right, but the grass was coming back where they'd been, and not coming back where they hadn't. So she was probably doing something right. An old man named Victor was teaching a group of 12-year-olds how to identify water sources by the behavior of specific plants and insects. He held a stripped willow branch, turned it slowly in his hands while the children watched. This was not metaphor, this was engineering. The children knew the difference. Their eyes had the quality of people learning something they understood they would need. Marisol came back to the ridge above Haida Gwaii and reported to Devlin and Yuki across the fire. "So we're not starting from nothing," Devlin said. "No, but we're not far off." She'd drawn a rough map on the inside cover of a paperback novel, the only paper she'd had, and she spread it on the ground between them. Lines indicating water, circles indicating people, X marks where the land was still dead. Yuki leaned over the map with her headlamp on, running a finger along what had been the Skeena River drainage. "Here," she said. "This is the one I want to start with." "The Skeena's contaminated," Devlin said. "The Skeena's contaminated from one specific point source." Yuki sat back, tapping the map. "There's a processor relay unit about 60 kilometers upstream that's been leaking coolant for 6 years. The coolant contains 3 compounds that I can neutralize using a base exchange process that requires." She paused and looked at them with the flat expression of someone about to say something unreasonable. "A clay deposit of a specific type, a heat source around 300 degrees, and about 400 kilograms of organic matter. Specifically, kelp," Marisol repeated. "Kelp. So you want us to haul 400 kilograms of kelp, 60 kilometers inland into the mountains. Closer to 70 with the switchbacks." Yuki retrieved the flask. "But yes, approximately." Devlin made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He'd been making that sound a lot since the ship left. It was the sound of a man recalibrating his understanding of what his life was going to look like. "The Veth," he said, "spent 41 years and the industrial output of a mid-tier stellar civilization extracting resources from this planet, because they determined it was more efficient than any alternative." "Correct," said Yuki. "And we're going to clean it up with kelp. And clay," she said, "and a fire." He made the sound again. This time it became an actual laugh, brief and sharp, and Marisol caught it from him like a cold. And then Yuki, and for a moment the three of them sat laughing in the dark on the edge of what used to be one of the most beautiful coastlines on Earth. And the laughter had an edge to it that had nothing to do with happiness. But it was real, and they needed it. The Veth had studied Earth extensively before the occupation. They had documentation on it that ran to approximately 9 million data units. Devlin had found a fractured data cache in an abandoned monitor station and managed to extract parts of it over several weeks using jury-rigged power from a solar array that had no business still functioning. The documentation was thorough. It covered geological surveys, atmospheric modeling, biomass measurements, population statistics. What it didn't have much of was the thing that Devlin came to think of as granular knowledge, the kind of knowledge that lives in a specific practice, a specific relationship, a specific creek, at a specific time of year. The Veth had known that kelp beds could indicate the presence of stable marine productivity zones. They had not known what Marisol knew, which was that specific varieties along specific coastlines had been sustainably harvested for thousands of years using harvest methods that maintained bed integrity. They had not known what Yuki knew, which was that certain decomposition products of that kelp, combined with the right clay, underwent a base exchange reaction that happened to be very effective at chelating specific heavy metal compounds. They had not known what Victor knew about willows, or what Hazel knew about grazing rotations. They had, the data cache suggested, regarded this kind of knowledge as outside the scope of a geological and atmospheric analysis. They had been, Devlin thought, reading the wrong documents. The journey to the relay station took 11 days. They went 6 people. By the end, Marisol and Devlin and Yuki and a young man named Sam, who had spent 3 years working in a Veth maintenance facility before the skeleton crew had left, and who understood the relay architecture well enough to tell them which components could be safely shut down versus which ones would result in an uncontrolled discharge of something worse than coolant. They also brought a quiet, competent woman named Dara, who didn't say much but could carry 60 kilograms uphill for 6 hours without complaint, which was a more specialized skill than it sounded. And they brought Victor, because Victor had asked to come, and nobody was going to tell an 83-year-old man who knew how to read water from willow behavior, that he couldn't go for a walk in the mountains. The relay station sat in a saddle between two peaks that the Veth had modified to accommodate their equipment. The original topography was still visible if you knew what to look for, the way a face is still visible under swelling. The station itself was a cluster of ceramic alloy structures, dull and functional, built to a scale that suggested the Veth's average individual was about 2 meters tall and had no particular opinion about aesthetic design. Cooling tubes ran down the slope to the east, and you could see even from a distance where one of them had failed. A dark stain on the rock that ran down toward the riverbed like a scar. Victor stood at the edge of the stain and looked down toward where the river was. "My grandfather used to fish this river," he said. Nobody said anything. Not here. About 30 kilometers down from here, where it widens out around the bend. He said the sockeye came up in a column so thick you could walk across them. He paused. "I never saw it like that. But I know where the column comes from. I know what it needs." He turned away from the stain and went to examine a cluster of plants at the edge of the undisturbed zone, and Devlin watched him and thought, that is what the Veth's 9 million data units could not hold. That line between a man and a river 30 kilometers long, running through 3 generations. The knowledge of what the river had been, and could be again, carried in a body as specific and irreplaceable as a fingerprint. He turned to Sam. "Which ones can we shut down?" Sam had already been walking the perimeter of the station with his hands in his pockets and the slightly unfocused look of someone running a calculation. He pointed to 3 of the structures. Those. The coolant cycling units for the main processing array. The array's been dormant for 8 months, so the cooling is just running on a maintenance loop. Shut those down, the leak stops. And those, Devlin indicated the remaining structures. Power relay for the outer system communication node. Sam shrugged. Nothing to communicate with anymore, but the relays still live. I wouldn't touch it without knowing where the other end goes. "Leave it," Marisol said. They worked for 2 days. Yuki set up the clay exchange process in a natural depression 50 meters downstream from the stain. She'd identified the right clay deposit 3 kilometers back, and they'd brought it up in containers. Dara built the fire. Kelp went in, clay went in, water from a clean tributary went in, heat went in, and Yuki stood over it with an expression of scientific concentration that Marisol found both exhausting and deeply reassuring. Sam and Devlin cycled down the Veth cooling units one at a time, monitoring the outputs, watching for the leak rate on the eastern tube to drop. It dropped. Slowly, then faster, then to nothing. The silence was different after that. The drip they hadn't consciously been registering as sound until it stopped, and its absence was noticeable in the way. Absences are when you realize something has been wrong for so long that you stopped naming it. Victor, sitting on a rock above the reaction pit where Yuki worked, said, "There's a prayer for this, for when water comes back to a place it left." He didn't say it aloud, or if he did, Marisol didn't hear the words. But she saw his lips move, and she looked away, because some things are private. The walk back was different from the walk in. They moved faster, partly because they weren't loaded with kelp, but partly because of something harder to name. Not celebration, exactly. More like the specific weight that lifts when a long thing is finished and a longer thing begins. They stopped where the river bent, downstream where Victor's grandfather had fished. The water was still discolored. It would be months, maybe years, before the full improvement worked down through the system. But the stain had stopped spreading. There was a boundary now, upstream, past which the damage would not go. Sam crouched at the bank and looked at the water. The Veth built the biggest receiver array in this part of the outer system, he said. He'd worked in their facilities for 3 years. He had thoughts about the Veth that he hadn't shared. The scale of it was, you couldn't look at it without feeling small. Kilometers across, absolutely precise. Beautiful, even, if you think about that kind of engineering. He picked up a stone, turned it over. They didn't know you could find water with a stick. They knew, Devlin said. It was in their database. Dowsing classified under cultural superstition. Sam smiled without warmth. Right classified. They made camp there, at the bend in the river. Yuki produced the flask. Dara ate in silence and then fell asleep with the abrupt completeness of someone who had no unresolved thoughts to keep them up. Victor told a story about his grandfather that took about 40 minutes and involved 3 false endings, each of which he seemed to find funnier than the last. Marisol sat by the water and listened to it. Not the story, which was about a fishing trip in a borrowed boat, and a sequence of mishaps that she followed only partially, but the sound of it, the cadence of a specific person who had lived in a specific place, moving through a specific memory that nobody else alive held. She thought about the Veth's 9 million data units. She thought about what they had not known to measure. She thought about what she knew that she had not yet written down. In the morning she started writing. She used the rest of the paperback novel, the inside covers in every blank margin, and the white strip at the bottom of every page. She wrote what she'd seen on her walk south along the coast. She wrote what Hazel had told her about the cattle rotation and the grass recovery. She wrote what Victor had said about the sockeye column, not the sentiment but the specifics. Which bend, which depth, which month, what the water temperature should be when the run peaks. She wrote it as precisely as she could, because precision was not the enemy of the kind of knowledge she was trying to capture. The Veth had thought it was. The Veth had thought precision, and this kind of knowledge were two different things. They weren't. They were the same thing, applied at different scales, and the error was in thinking that large-scale precision was the only kind that mattered. The others watched her write. Devlin eventually asked for a pen and started his own section in another novel he found in his pack. He had the habit of carrying books and had never lost it. Yuki began annotating the rough notes she'd kept during the clay exchange process, tightening the measurements, writing down the specific proportions that had worked. Sam started drawing diagrams of the relay station, not the whole thing but the shutdown procedures, the specific units, the sequence. Step by step, transferable. Victor watched all of this for a while from his rock at the river's edge. Then he said, to no one in particular, "We used to have a word for people who write down what other people know, not the people who know it, the people who write it down." Recorders, Marisol offered. He shook his head. Not quite. The word we had meant something more like, the people who make knowing survivable, the people who make it so that what one person learned doesn't die with them. He looked at the river. We lost a lot of those people over the years, but we still have the practice. We still know how to do it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Veth left 41 years of data about this planet. They had 9 million units, and they didn't know what the water looked like before they got here. Because they didn't write down what anyone knew. They only wrote down what they measured. He picked up a flat stone and sent it skipping across the surface of the river, once, twice, 3 times before it sank. And now they're gone. The river made it sound. Devlin capped his pen. There's a group in the interior, east side of the mountains. I heard about them before we left for the relay station. They've got seed stock, at least 100 varieties, plus the knowledge to work them. They've been asking around for anyone who knows watershed hydrology. Yuki looked up. And there's a kid in one of the coastal groups, maybe 17, who apparently built a functional wind turbine from Veth scrap components. He looked at the map. She wants to know if anyone can help her figure out how to tie it into a grid. Define grid, Marisol said. Define small, Devlin agreed. They looked at each other in the morning light by a river that was beginning, very slowly, in a way that would take years to become visible, to come back. The Veth had surveyed this world for 11 years before they began extracting it. They had data on every geological stratum, every atmospheric variable, every trophic level of every major ecosystem. They had built infrastructure on 4 continents and maintained it with a precision that no human civilization had matched. And when the planet no longer provided what they needed, they had left it, in the clean, unambiguous way that an empire leaves when it has extracted what it came for, without malice, without apology, without a backward look. They had not left everything. They had left the ones who knew the river. They had left the ones who knew the water. They had left the practice of making knowledge survivable. Marisol Red Cloud stood up from the riverbank, put her filled notebook in her pack, and said, "All right. Who goes to the interior first, and who goes to find the kid with the turbine?" It was morning. The sky was ordinary. The river ran the color it was beginning to become, which was not clean yet but was cleaner. And the direction of travel mattered more than the distance still to go. They divided the map. They started walking.